great pleasure to welcome all of you in the morning for those of you joining us from North or South America, or good afternoon for those of you who are based here in Europe or other places. Great pleasure to welcome you all for this first joint event that our Digital Law Center organizes together with the Global Network of Internet and Society Centers, which is widely known as the Network of Centers, NoC. This learning call that our DLC is hosting today with the Network of Centers is the opportunity to learn and to discuss openly in a conversational way about a very intriguing topic, which is the taxation of AI. As we know, this is something that we see daily in the media. There is a very intensive discussion about various facets of AI policy, but there's much less discussion about the tax policy implications of AI. For this reason, we're very happy to host this session on this challenging and promising topic entitled Taxing AI, a Tool for AI Governance. And it is a special privilege for us and for me personally also to welcome my law school professor and colleague Xavier Oberson to address this topic, knowing that he has published extensively on the topic and has just published a book, and we will share the link to the book in a few seconds. And the presentation of Xavier Oberson will be followed by comments made by Armando Español, who is the executive director of the Network of Center, and we'll then open up the floor for discussion, which can be kept informal. The session will be moderated by Sylvan, who has many activities, but one of which is to be a senior director at the Secretariat of the Network of Centers, and to whom I will give the floor in a few seconds. Let me just seize the opportunity to express our deep and my deep gratitude to our colleagues at the Network of Centers for their cooperation in putting together this learning call. Just 2 words on housekeeping. As you may have seen, the session is recorded, and we plan to make it available online on the website of our digital center. And a final housekeeping note, would be grateful if that's feasible for our online participants to please turn the camera on as a matter and a sign of courtesy to our speaker, moderator, and panelists. Now, without further ado, I'll now give the floor to Sylvan, and I thank you all for your participation to our session today.
Hello, everyone. We're very glad to have you as we present this topic, an important topic, taxing AI, and a novel topic, one that I think is under-addressed and one that we can dig into today. And when I say dig into the conversation, I hope very much that you will participate. This is a small group with some wonderful experts as resources. And so I encourage you, as you are listening to them speak and listening to their dialogue with one another, to put your questions in the chat. At the end of our session today, we will have an opportunity to discuss specific questions that or concerns or interests that we all have regarding taxing AI. And so I encourage you to please go ahead and as Professor de Werra said, turn your cameras on if you are able. We understand that not everyone is able to turn cameras on for a whole variety of reasons. And with that, I will turn the conversation over to Professor Xavier Oberson, who is a professor in Swiss and International Tax Law at the Faculty of Law at the University of Geneva. He is also the founder and director of the LLM Tax at the University of Geneva. And he has written multiple books on taxing robots, and is an expert on this novel and important subject of taxing AI. after Javier speaks, I will introduce the director of the Network of Centers, the executive director, Armando Guio, but I will provide more details about his background momentarily. With that, I turn it over to you, Professor Oberson, for your initial presentation.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you to give me the opportunity to present my works on the taxation of artificial intelligence. I would say that so we have a PowerPoint presentation that to summarize a little bit the content of the book in a way. And I must say, when I started to present this topic, I made a conference. It was in 2016 and then 2017 at the University of Geneva. It raised a lot of attention. It was quite interesting, but also a lot of criticism. And I must even say, even insult, you know. I receive aggressive emails, and this has never occurred to me before. And then I thought, oh la la, this is really a challenging topic. But in a way, it has pushed me to go further and to study even in more details and depth this topic, which it seems to be rather sensitive in a way. And right now, you see all over the world researcher in this area. We have organized, in fact, 1 month ago in Geneva, a conference, and we had professor from the United States, from Brazil, from Vienna, from many different universities focusing now on this topic. So let's say to start, so maybe you can go to slide already, I would say number 3. This is just the content. So as you know, AI is now used everywhere. At the beginning, it was really focusing on industry. For example, you would see cars manufactured in factories already now 80%, 90% by robots. But now, more importantly, you also see now the AI, which is used in services. So in medicine, banking, you have the so-called robo advisors. You have now also in entertainment. As you may know, I'm also very much involved into the music business, because I'm vice president, chairman of the Montreux Jazz Festival, for example, and we see more and more artists using AI, hospitality, agriculture, etc. And what has happened also a few years ago is the development of new models, machine learning, ChatGPT, etc. So the concern is growing, and the concern is on the impact of this development in the labor market on the one hand, and on the equality and inequality potential between the distribution of wealth. What I want to say already at this stage is that when I started to focus on this topic, my first book was called Taxation of Robots. But already at that time, I tried to develop a rather broad concept of robots, because, and this is, we will discuss further, this is one of the main criticism we see against the taxation of robots, people saying it's impossible to define a robot for tax purposes. And in a way, it's not so wrong, to the extent that you should focus, I think, not on the definition of robot as some kind of entity. It's more the impact of the robot, and it's now the impact of artificial intelligence on the economy, which is relevant. And that's why I try to develop what I call a form-neutral definition of AI, which focus on its impact and not on its form. Because especially in the tax world, it would be otherwise very easy to circumvent the rules and just to say we put all the intelligence in a software which would be cited somewhere in the cloud and not in a specific state. So what is relevant is really the impact of AI. Now we move to the next next slide, which is, of course, this crucial question. There are conferences all over the world. There are reports by various organizations, the United Nations, the WTO, etc., the WEF also, on the so-called future of work. So the big question is to say, what will be the impact of AI on work? So I don't have a crystal ball, of course, and but in summary, I could say there are two schools of thought, okay? You have the optimist on the one hand, which is probably the majorities today, still today, which say, in fact, we should not worry so much on the impact of work because innovation will foster new jobs, and we will have of course, some job, repetitive, boring work will disappear and will be replaced by AI. But as a whole, new job will be created and the whole economy will prosper, which is a little bit the Schumpeter view of the so-called destruction, positive destruction of jobs. You have the pessimist on the other hand. So the pessimist, they say, this time it is different. The famous quote, this time is different. They say, why this time is different? Because, of course, we are talking about artificial intelligence. We are creating tools and machines that may replace, in fact, any jobs in the long term, and even maybe replace human intelligence. So these are really two extreme views, so a very optimistic one and a very pessimistic one. And my position is to say, it is clear, and we already see that in the short term, there will be already a big disruption and many jobs will disappear. Some people would be unable to adapt rapidly enough to this new world. So at least there will be some people that would need some help. But if the pessimists are right, we are in a very problematic situation. Because if the pessimists are right, there's the so-called triple negative effect. First of all, if labor shrinks drastically, the wage disappears, and therefore the income tax will be in a big difficulty. Secondly, there will be additional need for the social security to help the people who are now unemployed. And third, there's also an additional problem, a huge problem for the economy, which is the consumption. Because if people don't have enough income, they cannot consume anymore. And this is also a problem for the value added tax. I'm not saying this is what will happen, but I'm saying there's a risk that this would happen. And as you know, if you want to introduce a significant tax reform, as we see what happened with the so-called BEPS program at the OECD, it took already 10 years, and we are not even sure that this whole program will be implemented. You see the same also for environmental taxation, the difficulty to reach a consensus on this kind of global issues. So my point is to say we should study right now, immediately, potential solution for these issues. And one of the solutions, in my view, is a taxation of artificial intelligence. If the pessimists become the truth, then we have the tools to address this issue. And if the optimists are right, maybe we won't need this taxation of artificial intelligence. There's an additional problem, and on this one, I think there's really a consensus, is that the artificial intelligence will grow inequalities, and also a taxation of artificial intelligence could be a solution to address that problem. So we can move to next slide. And in parallel, what is quite interesting is that in parallel, there has been some discussion on the idea to grant some kind of legal personality to robots And this was a report of February 2017 from the EU Parliament. At the end, this idea was not accepted and was not implemented, but this is already an interesting development as well, which tend to define some criteria to grant some kind of legal personality for AI. And at that time, it was really focusing on a robot. In my view, again, when we try to define AI for tax purpose, we should focus on the autonomy of AI. This is the criteria which differentiate AI with a machine and not on its appearance. So I suggest and I prefer some kind of form neutral approach. Now, if we want to introduce a taxation of AI, we should find a justification for this. So we can move to next slide. Every time you introduce a new tax, you need just a justification, right? So you need an economic justification and you need a legal constitutional justification. If you take the economic perspective, I think one potential approach would be the following. Would be to say, which is some kind of tax that, by the way, we have in Switzerland, and the idea that I developed on that is a little bit, I think, a consequence of the Swiss tax on so-called imputed rental income. You know, on the Swiss law, if you are the owner of a house or an apartment, you are subject to an income tax, which is the tax on the rent that you should have paid theoretically to live in this home. Now, you could make the case by saying, if an enterprise is using a robot or artificial intelligence instead of a human worker, you can make the case by saying, isn't it some kind of a value added or some kind of profit, in the sense that this enterprise will spare the salary that it should have paid to a human worker. And this could be regarded from an economic standpoint as a kind of imputed theoretical income. So that would be one way to justify economically. Of course, we can discuss about it, taxation of robots. There's another approach which has been also advocated by some commentators elsewhere, and to develop a principle of neutrality between AI or robot workers and human workers. Now we move to the difficult part, which is the legal perspective. The problem we have in order to implement a taxation of artificial intelligence is the problem of the so-called constitutional principle of ability to pay. You know, under most constitutional law that I know, any tax is governed by the principle of ability to pay. You should have, as a taxpayer, some kind of economic ability to pay the tax, right? The problem is that a robot or artificial intelligence, as such today, they don't have any ability to pay. I mean, a robot has no money to pay the tax. Artificial intelligence has nothing to pay the tax. So right now, there's no ability to pay in the constitutional sense of the term to robot and artificial intelligence, which goes toward a rather revolutionary point of view, which is to say, okay, right now, it doesn't have an ability to pay, but maybe in the future it would. Once we start to consider that a robot or artificial intelligence is some kind of legal entity, as we did 1 century ago with corporation, it could then very well have some kind of objective ability to pay, a financial even possibility to pay the tax. This is quite possible. It is even technically possible. And some people are already thinking about and I'm really advocating this approach to say maybe one day in the future, we can define an entity as artificial intelligence with some kind of financial means to pay the tax and therefore with ability to pay. The problem is that right now it doesn't exist. So my suggestion is to divide the approach of taxing robots in two different stages. First, we should focus then on the use of AI by enterprises, because enterprises, they have the ability to pay. But at a second stage, only once a legal ability to pay has been established for AI, we could even consider, which would be a rather revolutionary approach, to introduce in the future a tax on AI as such. So now, if you agree very quickly, I could just try to show you some kind of models, potential models of this type of taxes. So I would, if we go to next slide, I would just show some models of the taxes on the use of AI. And then I will also show you some potential future models for a tax on AI as such, you know, regarded as an entity. So a tax on the use of AI, one possibility is the one that I'm really advocating in the book, which is this kind of imputed salary, which is the salary that the enterprise should have paid to human workers instead of robot workers. Another approach which has been also described is so-called automation taxes. So you have, for example, one commentator which has suggested a tax which would be based on a ratio. So, for example, a ratio on human workers in comparison to the total turnover or total profit of a company. And you also have already now in some states some special automation taxes. By the way, in Geneva, there was a draft cantonal tax on the cash register, automated cash register. It has not been implemented, but I saw recently also in Belgium that there was this kind of tax which has been proposed. Another alternative is to work on presumption, so with some kind of a ratio based on turnover, etc. And the South Korea has introduced another theoretical model of tax on AI, which has been sometimes described as the first robo-tax ever developed by a state. But the Koreans, they developed a system which is an indirect tax on the use of robots because they reduced the incentive, special amortization rule, etc., in favor of robotization. And it's interesting because, by the way, South Korea is one of the most developed countries as far as AI is concerned. An alternative which was also suggested by a Nobel Prize Professor Schiller, he wrote an article a few years ago advocating some kind of Pigouvian taxes. So for you, a Pigouvian tax is an instrument which is, in fact, a bit like the pollution tax, is a tax which is designed to internalize the negative cost which is caused by a specific behavior. A typical Pigouvian tax is a tax on CO2, for example. I mean, you tax the producer of CO2, and this is the way to implement the polluter pay principle. So we could also consider introduce tax on AI, but this is a different perspective, is to cover the costs which are caused by replacement of workers, for example, social security, unemployment, pensions, etc. And finally, another tax on the use of AI could be the use of the value-added tax. And I don't have time to develop here, but there are very interesting possibilities to use the value-added tax. Then, if we move to the second possibility, yes, you can move exactly. Thank you. So, which is the most, I would say, revolutionary, which then requires that AI would be maybe in the future recognized as an entity, as such, and therefore subject to some kind of profit tax. And if you think about it, 1 century ago, this is what happened for corporations. I mean, a corporation doesn't exist. It's not, you don't shake hands with a corporation. A corporation is a mere fiction which has been designed by the state under a legislation and with specific criteria. Maybe the time has come to think about those criteria for AI under some specific condition. And then you could, of course, introduce a tax on the profit of this type of corporation. And I've given you some different models. Then the last, so we can move to the next slide. The last possibility, which already exists, but it's not so interesting in my view, because it's some kind of taxes like a tax on cars, a tax on dogs, you know. It's considered taxing AI as an object. For example, a tax on drone. It already exists in some states in the United States, in California, for example, or a tax on autonomous vehicles. Now, if we move on, so there are alternative solutions. So, of course, all these ideas have been sometimes heavily criticized, you can imagine. Some others are you know, also encourage them or approve them. There's a lot of debate. It's a very interesting debate, I think, on these various models of taxation of artificial intelligence. But some of the critics, the people that criticize this solution, they tend to suggest alternative approach. So I just wanted to show them to you, sorry. One is to say, well, you don't need to tax artificial intelligence, just tax more heavily corporations, because at the end of the day, the corporations are using this artificial intelligence. The same is to say labor is taxed too heavily right now in comparison to capital income. So maybe we could increase the taxation of capital income. Other saying, you know, these big tech companies in the digital economy are using a lot artificial intelligence. So why don't we tax, in fact, the digital services? And the last, on which I also wrote a book, by the way, with Alara Yazisoglu. It's a book that was published in 2023, is to tax data as an alternative to taxing artificial intelligence. I could speak about all these options. I just want to say the first three really focus on the profit of companies. They are not revolutionary as such. And I think it's just some kind of I would say, modification of the profit tax, but they don't really take into account the specificities of artificial intelligence. Taxing data, however, is an interesting approach, but it is more focusing on the input side of a company, like, you know, like you tax oil as a good which is then used to produce something. You could consider to tax data as an input, and then the output would be more on the artificial intelligence. And my last slide is just to say that all these issues need an international framework, because I don't think it would make a lot of sense to introduce a Swiss robot tax because of competitive problems, competition among states, and it would be very easy to put all the artificial intelligence and robots in another state, which is more favorably taxed. So an international framework is required. The United Nations could be very relevant, the OECD, the EU. This is something that needs to be developed further. And it's true that there is a clear link between the taxation on the digital economy and the taxation of artificial intelligence, because, as I said, these big multinational entities focusing on digital economy are using extensively artificial intelligence. And to finish, I would say that there are many issues which are raised by the use of AI, which are completely new, are not developed. All the double taxation treaties, for example, do not focus, and we don't really know how they would apply to taxation of AI, the transfer pricing rules. I mean, all the main international rules would need to be at least modified or adapted to the taxation of AI. And this is one of the main criticisms I personally make in this famous BEPS initiative of the OECD in 2015, the BEPS program, which was a fascinating program, but they did not really cover or focus. Maybe it was too early. It was 2015. The issue of robots and later on artificial intelligence. And I think now the time has come to include this topic, this problem, into the analysis of international tax law. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Javier Oberson, and we are very glad to hear your thoughts and to see this book that I'm sure we're all excited to read. I have read a little bit of myself, and it was quite fascinating. I am now going to turn the mic over to Executive Director Armando Guio. Armando is the director of the network of centers, as we have mentioned. And in addition to that, Armando has advised many public, national governments, private entities all around the world through his work at the Network of Centers, but also as in his previous work in the CAF Development Bank of Latin America, where he led the design of the first AI Governmental Council of Latin America and the Caribbean. Armando travels the world thinking about AI governance with a variety of leaders, and really truly builds a network of people thinking about these issues. So I can't imagine a better respondent to this topic, taxing AI, than Executive Director Armando Guio. Armando, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Liz, and well, thank you for that introduction. And of course, thank you for the Center Digital Law Center in Switzerland, and to Jacques and all the team. It's been really a privilege to hear from Professor Javier, and also to have Liz moderation, which is also a great opportunity. And of course, it's also a privilege here with the two of you. Just by hearing to Professor Javier, I think this is a very important discussion. And as you mentioned, Liz, we at the network of centers, we had been actively working with different stakeholders, policymakers, and decision makers around the world, many of them in majority world countries, global South countries, on what it's now this idea of governing, regulating, and deciding on the future of artificial intelligence and many other emerging technologies. And I think that Professor Javier's points are quite relevant and important for the discussion we're having. And sometimes, and I want to start by saying this, is Professor Javier is quite brave in doing this and sharing this idea of taxation, because of course, sometimes this is a point that creates some controversy, brings criticism, and of course, generates some tension that some try to avoid. And I think this is a question that we need to address. And that's one of the first things I would like to highlight from all what we have been hearing. And it's like, we really need to address this point on taxation. And especially because the taxation point is also a question that is also taking us about the social impact of AI, how AI is having an impact on many societies, many countries, many nations and regions around the world, and what are we going to do to fix some of the issues and some of the biggest problems that we are facing due to the implementation and the accelerated implementation of AI in many countries around the world. So just briefly, I wanted to share my screen and share with you presentation, some slides here. So here, as you can see, we are talking about basically a conversation that, as Professor Javier already addressed and already showed to us, we need to have about AI. And for example, we have been having this idea floating around about the universal income and the way in which we're going to solve a big process of job displacement and of perhaps job the loss of jobs, and sorry for the cat here, but basically how we're going to face this issue and these social issues. And one of the ideas about how to solve this is the universal income. Of course, there needs to be some taxation in order to fund some kind of universal income project or some kind of universal income program. And that's where I think this turns to be so relevant, because this is not going to be just funded by the money that governments already have. So just give me 1 second, sorry. Let me mute myself here. I don't see my I didn't see my mute button, but okay. So basically what we are seeing here, it's like, okay, where is this money going to come from and how are we going to work on this? And perhaps one of the first reactions I also wanted to share about Professor Javier explanation is that we have a big challenge, and it's going to be a challenge on the implementation side. I know we are thinking about more of a theoretical proposal and also how we can make this proposal real. But when we get to implementation, it's when I think this is going to get a little bit more complicated. But of course, that's going to be one of the biggest parts of the conversation. But do we need to address this? Definitely. And why? Because we're seeing this kind of unfair and pretty much unfair practices and very much sad things that are going on but with the global chain of artificial intelligence. One of them, for example, the exploitation of workers on different sides of the world. This is something, and also I've been learning of this more also because of Liz Sylvan's great work and also on identifying this. But for example, how African workers are being paid for training data and for helping to develop some of this technology in such an unfair way, basically getting paid even less than $1 in some cases per hour in order to work on data training. This is completely something that we really need to solve. And this is something in which basically there has to be some solution, because this is a market that is completely wrong. And again, it's completely unfair. And of course, people have to accept this kind of works because of different reasons. But if we look into this, we see that these technologies being developed in specific places are having an impact on workers and the quality of work and the quality of life and the quality of income they're getting in many other different regions in the world. And how are we going to fix this? Perhaps an answer can be taxation. Of course, then we're going to have the question like, who's taxing this? How are we going to take this tax money, transfer it to those that are having the whole burden? Well, that's a discussion to have. But we see this kind of very unfair practices which we really need to solve. And again, and what Professor Javier mentioned, it's that we have a big risk of job displacement and of losing a lot of jobs around the world. So for example, in Latin America, last study from the World Bank says that up to 5% of jobs in Latin America could basically be eliminated. And of course, this brings a lot of questions. Okay, so we implement this technology basically in these regions, in these countries, and basically that's it. If we have some job displacement, if people lose their jobs, what are we going to do about that? And that's where we go back again into the universal income question. And why don't we develop this kind of universal income programs in regions in which basically even people getting retirement funds or retirement pensions, it's even a challenge. Now, thinking about how we get into universal income, it's going to be completely a challenge, and it's going to be quite difficult to understand. And from those elements, and when you see this on that perspective, you say, okay, yes, now someone needs to pay for this, and there's have been some unfair practices that we really need to solve. And of course, we also have a big issue about the climate impact and the, of course, the environmental impact of this technology. Who is going to pay also for this kind of damage, basically? And if we're spending a lot of resources, water and many other resources, and very important resources such as water, we're not talking about any specific natural resource or very much talking about something for the production side. We're talking about water, which is basically what we live from, and a basic element for the existence of life in the world. And basically, this is being used for these systems to operate. Who is paying for perhaps the damage and the loss of these resources that will never be returned in some way? So basically, who is paying for this kind of investment that we all are doing by accepting that natural resources of the world are used up to feed and to allow the operation of this technology? Well, it seems taxes have a strong argument then. Then you say like, okay, let's tax some of these companies. Let's look into who specifically to tax. And it seems like this could be a solution. And I think in that case, we have a strong case for analyzing this. But well, we have a problem. And for example, if we see this from the perspective of the global south and the majority world, basically, we have a huge problem in tax evasion. So it's an estimated, for example, in the global south to be worth, and this is a report from 2021, to be worth $23 billion. That's a lot of money that it's not being paid. So can we tax the technology? Can we use our tax system if probably the tax system already is broken and we actually need to fix the tax system to solve many of the issues it has on the global south, and then we can start considering on using it for the proposal that Professor Xavier just showed to us. So my first point there will be like, we have to be super careful on how much enthusiasm we have about the tax systems, as the tax systems themselves are having a lot of issues right now. So of course that doesn't mean, and again, we go back to the argument, we need taxation, and probably we need that taxation as it was being mentioned, and we will have these discussions for sure, and we will look into the tax systems, but the tax systems still are facing a lot of challenges, and the evasion, for example, is one of the biggest problems we're having right now. Also, having a fair voice in these global taxing rules. Basically, if we're going to talk about taxation, we're talking about a global conversation, and that's why this is so interesting for the network of centers and the global network of centers, because basically this taxation is not only something that takes place within a region or within a country. This is now a global endeavor, and basically when we're taxing, we're talking about different countries involved. As we know, many different schemes to avoid taxation involve many different countries around the world. So keeping this as a country or single region conversation, I think it's not possible. But then we have the questions on how we're going to allow these interactions to take place, and also how we are going to provide, for example, for colleagues from the global south to have a good and proper voice on these conversations about taxation and the way in which we are implementing many of these new taxes. And that's something in which basically we want to take this proposal further. We will really need to analyze how these conversations are taking place and the entities and the scenarios in which we basically want to have these kind of discussions for the future of AI, and of course a proposal such as this. And then we have the big idea, and of course, I'm not an economist, but I know that we will have that, and I know Professor Xavier is very much, and he showed to us, very much conscious. We don't want to get into the economical, very technical issues on the economics of this, but basically, who is going to pay, and are we completely and entirely sure that those that are paying for the taxes are going to be those that are actually, should be the ones that are paying? I mean, the ones using the resources, the ones underpaying their workers or paying a very short amount, or generating the job displacements. Those that are generating those practices are going to be exactly the ones that are going to be taxated. And why am I saying this? Because in taxation, as we all know, not necessarily when you have a tax, that means that tax is going to be paid necessarily by a company or by the individual you actually are targeting with this tax. Sometimes it can be consumers that are the ones that are going to have the burden of paying the tax. Yeah, and of course, it depends of the kind of good we're talking about, and this depends on many things. As I'm mentioning, we can get very technical here, but we have to be absolutely certain and very much careful about who is going to at the end pay the tax. And if and this also, and thinking of the work we do in the global south, in the majority world, that's a big question for us, because this tax proposal, one thing we want to avoid is to limit the access to technology, is to generate a burden that will increase existing inequalities and will allow just few to have access, because it increases the prices of this and increases the price up to access to this technology, which at the end it generates a lot of inequality. So basically, we want to be very careful, and we will have to test this in different ways, and in a way in which it allows us to see which taxes work, what kind of tax scheme will operate. And I think Professor Javier already explained to us some of the proposals there are, but this is a point that we have to be extremely careful, because we don't want to take the consumers to take the burden, but also we don't want to all at the same time that they're taking the burden to generate limitations to the access to this technology to many places in which already this costs a lot, and in which basically, if we're not able to take these to many more, we are increasing a digital gap, an AI gap, and many other gaps that basically can become quite problematic. So there, of course, I'm a big promoter, and of course, I always talk about the sandbox idea, but I think here, for example, it will be very interesting to analyze if we have already a AI tax proposal, if we have something very specific, that we can test this, not necessarily in a sandbox, but that we can test it. And we can look into it and see how it operates, how it works, the kind of impacts, negative or bad impacts it has in a safe space, and then to see how to scale. And that's, I think, one of the biggest challenges, and I think that some of the criticism from the taxation perspective or approach to AI is about the idea of scaling. And if we take this to a global scale, we take this to a big scale on how we're going to tax, without testing before and without being very careful about some of these elements that I have just mentioned, perhaps we're going to see that there's going to be a lot of resistance. And I think that if we're able to, in some way, test what's going on with this taxation program, what we are trying to achieve, if we're able to measure this and we're able to get some good evidence of how it will operate, then I think that will generate a bigger, even more robust argument towards having this kind of taxation. And that's where I think we need to be in some way perhaps more strategic, if we can call it that, but at the same time we need to gather the evidence that shows that basically taxation brings and allow us to have some positive elements. And for now, I think that we are lacking of that evidence in some ways. Of course, Professor Javier and others have been making a very rigorous work, but I still think, especially on the implementation side, we need to see some of these ideas being implemented in a small way and a small pilot to then see how we're going to scale them. And that's something in which we take that approach. Perhaps that could be an element of consideration. But at the end, what it's very much and what I'm fascinated about this discussion is that, and this conversation we're having, is that we go back to the ethics of AI, and we go back to the foundations of all these conversations. Yes, we can talk about taxation. Yes, we can talk about how to implement it. We can talk about even having some testing on some of these programs, but definitely this is an ethical discussion. It's a question about fairness, how fair it's the world right now, and AI is helping us to achieve that, and how we have to solve that, and we are using taxation, I think, in order to solve a lot of unfair practices and a lot of unfair scenarios that we are actually seeing and that we are envisioning that will happen in the next years. And for example, the job displacement, is that fair? For some will be, for some will not be. It's an ethical discussion again, because it depends on the kind of ethical elements that guide or vision of the world, but also that will guide policy and decision makers. And that's what makes this so interesting. And I also was fascinated by hearing about the nature of AI. Well, how are we going to see AI in the next years? as a subject of taxation, as an object of taxation, as almost an individual. That brings us back to many of the questions we have been discussing on the ethics of AI, about the nature of AI, if we consider that it has the capacity in order to be taxated, or if it has the capacity or responsibility, or it's accountable for some of the impact it has, which is, of course, taking us back to those discussions about how are we looking into AI, and how are we looking into AI as not only as an object, as it was said, as a drone, for example, or as something different, an in-between that basically is also has the impact of an individual, so I can tax it as an individual. And although it seems to have a very pragmatic approach at the same time, it also has a lot of ethical implications, which it's fascinating to see. So I think we're getting back to these discussions, and that's where I really like what Professor Xavier has been provocating in that sense, and has been taking us to discuss. We will need to address these points. I think that's coming and of the literature and of the reports, and even the draft bills and some of the proposals to regulate AI on different places. Taxation still is not something that is being widely discussed. We have more. We have been seeing more actions against misinformation, disinformation, or labeling data, or perhaps some responsible use and risk monitoring. But about these kind of specific solutions, that's something that we haven't seen. My perspective, and what I think it's coming, of course, and is that after some years we will see the huge impact technology had on society, had on environment, had on sustainability. And then we're going to start going back and seeing into these kind of programs and taxation proposals in order to start solving many of these questions. And that's where I think this work, it's pioneering that policy dialogue that we should have. It's absolutely fascinating in that sense. And it's one conversation that definitely we should not avoid, that we will need to have. And that I appreciate what Professor Xavier and Jacques all have been doing by organizing this, because this is something that we will need to discuss. And just as a last point, from a global majority world perspective, and as a Colombian, and also as a person that works with different colleagues in majority world countries, this is something that could be fundamental to solve many of the issues that will come with this AI change, revolution, if we want to call it, that we are experiencing. And this is a way of also being part of a bigger conversation, and also of trying to solve many of the problems we will be facing, not only because of AI, but we are already facing for many different reasons. So I'm sure this is going to come to be a big topic, and I understand why many will not be happy to hear this, but I think it's quite relevant, and it's quite important that we start taking our own approach, and that we're seeing these kind of interesting proposals, such as the one made by Professor Xavier, and basically take from there and see what will be fundamental for majority world countries to engage into this, and what it's the approach also majority world countries can have on this point. So that's also something that hopefully we can promote from the NoC. And the idea, more than saying, yes, let's tax AI or not tax AI, it's how to build our own experience and our own evidence in order to understand what should be the stand of different countries in the majority world towards AI tax, because I'm sure it will be a conversation that, again, we will have. So those are my points and my reactions. And again, thank you all. And thank you, Professor Xavier. And leave it to you then, Liz, for moderate this other conversation we're having here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Armando. And I think we all appreciate the comments and the responses that you just gave for Professor Javier's Oberson's talk on taxing AI. In a moment, I think what I'll do is I'll turn the conversation back to you, Professor Xavier, to respond to Armando's many points. Before I do, I would like to just ask the group, since you've now heard something about taxing AI and some responses to that and its impact on different parts of the world, including the majority world. What are your thoughts and feelings and reactions to taxing AI? And are you thinking a little bit differently about it now? So I encourage you and hope that you will put some of your thoughts, feelings, and reactions to taxing AI in the chat, so that we can get some sense of your thoughts as we get to the end of this conversation. Now what I'll do is I'll turn the conversation over to Professor Xavier. You have just heard from Armando Guio about some context about the urgency of the problem related to labor, how the urgency is different in different parts of the world, the sort of context of AI governance more broadly, and different approaches such as sandboxing that may be one way of experimenting with the many models that you gave towards the end of your talk. How would you like to respond to Executive Director's Armando Guio's thoughts on your presentation?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you very much, Armando Guido, for your very interesting thoughts and remarks. So yes, at the end of the day, I agree, this is also an ethical discussion. And we also have this ethical discussion on the burden of the tax. Your point, for example, on who really pays the tax is crucial. That's right. Because, for example, if we introduce a tax on AI, but then the cost is just shifted to the consumer, then this is not really what we want to achieve totally. So, and also what you mentioned, if there's a clear link between the so-called universal income, unconditional income, which could be also one solution. But let's say the discussion on taxing AI is on the financing part, and the universal unconditional income would be one of the potential use of the money flowing from the robot tax or AI tax. By the way, there was a candidate in France for the presidency in France, Mr. Benoît Hamon, who has suggested at the end of his campaign this unconditional income. And he also, but really towards the end, discussed a little bit about taxation of robots. So, but of course, it was much too early at that time. He was not very successful because he was not, of course, chosen as a candidate for the presidency at the end. But this idea, I completely agree, there's a clear link between the two, taxing AI and unconditional income. And then the issue of also like workers who are used as a labor force and who have been paid are paid almost nothing, especially in developing countries. This is also a problem that could be addressed by a taxation of robots, and also by the taxation of data, because these people are usually used quite extensively to check data or to help these companies which are using data for advertising purposes or profiling, etc. So there are solutions which are discussed also to pay more adequately all the people helping toward this data gathering in the data gathering process. So this is what I can maybe comment in addition to what Armando Guido has mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I might just try to squeeze one very quick question from the audience for Professor Xavier. Catherine Lowe asks about how might tax be used as a way to mitigate harms, like harms to privacy, bias, and mis or disinformation? And could you quickly respond to that before we end our call?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. you know, there's this regulation which is required and which is developed, for example, in the EU, also with the AI Act, etc. And I think personally, maybe the tax could also be a way to regulate more this AI. And this, for example, if you want to raise a tax on a company, you need reporting, you need clear rules, you need accounting, you need a lot of things in order to make sure that the tax is properly computed and implemented. But at the same time, you would introduce liability rules for the directors, for the people involved. And this kind of liability go much beyond the tax aspect. So why don't we think similarly in the case of AI? We can develop the tax, put some financial means for the ability to pay component of an AI system, but then at the same time, we would have some liability rules for the people involved, for the directors, etc., which could also serve for regulatory purposes and even maybe regulatory and equity purposes, I would say.
Thank you so much. And I know we're right on the hour, so I'm going to quickly pass the mic over to Jacques de Werra to close the call. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Liz. Thank you very much, Xavier, Oberson, to you, Armando, Español, for a truly great session. I think I was very intrigued and also perhaps reassured when, Xavier, you mentioned that we can hopefully learn from the past when you refer to corporate tax, basically, which is a fiction and which might potentially be serving as a model. I would have a question that we can leave open because I think it's would be perhaps leading us too far, is to see if the idea is, obviously, as you were mentioning, Armando, is to implement and find ways to implement, where shall be the right forum? If the OECD is perhaps not appropriate for the reason that were mentioned, because it might be focusing on certain countries, where shall the initiative come from? And obviously, I guess some of you would look at certain countries and regions to perhaps have the lead. And my question that I had in my mind, and again, not for discussion right now, unless Xavier or Armando really want to react right now, is what can we expect from the Trump/Elon Musk administration? I guess not a lot of pressure for taxation, as we know, but would that somehow be something that might hinder progress or any moves in a direction or another on that front? And I don't know, very quickly, because indeed we're running out of time, whether Xavier or Armando, you may want to react briefly to that as to the potential forum that might take the discussion further and bring that into action. Xavier, any?
Yes, maybe a quick comment. Yes, I think with the election of Trump in the United States, it will be a step against any multilateral solution which seem to be required in this area of artificial intelligence. You can see, for example, the so-called Pillar 1 of the OECD proposal, which would have suggested a different rule for taxation of profits for big multinational entities in favor of market state. And many commentators are saying now that maybe even Pillar 1 is dead, because at least the United States and many countries will not sign today this multilateral agreement, which was, however, approved 3 years ago. So this is a step in the wrong direction. I agree with you. So that now the forum, the United Nations would be, I think, of course, a relevant forum, or even some regional, I would say, areas. It could be South America, it could be the EU as well, Asia. That would be also an alternative forum, I would say.
Thanks very much. Armando, any quick reaction?
If I could, I would like to hear from, and sorry to do this, but if I could hear from Liz who also has a lot very good context of the US and has been working on this. I don't know, Liz, if you have to there a comment, that would be amazing if you can share with us briefly.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say that that Trump has already said that he plans to get rid of the AI Bill of Rights work that the Biden administration put in, and which is a disappointment. But he has a really interesting. I don't expect taxing is going to be appealing. Taxing AI is going to be appealing. Period. But you know, who knows? Really, who knows? But you know, he does have Elon Musk speaking to him quite a bit. Elon Musk was actually supportive of a bill that was vetoed in California by Governor Newsom that had problems, but would have provided some human rights protections. So I think it's more complicated than it might initially seem, just on what we think of as the general tendency of the incoming administration.
Yeah, that's very much. Thank you for that, Lisa. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Thank you again, Jacques.
Thank you so much to all of you again, to our speaker, Xavier Oberson, to our commentator, Armando, Guio, Español, to our moderator. Thanks very much for the input, Liz, Sylvan. Many thanks also, quite importantly, to Amiu Joseph from our Digital Law Center, as well as to Laura Rocha from the Network of Center for the instrumental help in putting this session together. So we haven't solved everything, but that was not necessarily the plan. But at least we've initiated a very important discussion. So many thanks to all of you, and looking forward to continuing the session and discussion at another occasion. Thanks very much, and bye-bye to all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks so much.